Well, good afternoon to you and happy solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. We've had a lot of solemnities lately, so I think we're pretty much running out of solemnities, so you're back to ordinary, regular feast days soon. And today is a special day for me, and I'm not sure of the other legionaries that you know, but for most of us that are more or less my age or older, today is the day that a lot of us got ordained to deacons. So 20 years ago today, I was ordained to the diaconate. So I had to really fight for that. I was actually just kind of noticing that. I don't know if Adelia was ordained. Adelia, were you ordained a deacon today? Adelia también. And it's a big deal, especially, why do we make such a big deal out of the solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul? First of all, they are considered generally to be, maybe together with St. John, the great apostles. So the greatest of the apostles of their generation would be Peter, Paul, and then kind of arguably St. John would fit into there. And when you live in the city of Rome in particular, you see their statues and their pictures everywhere. Well, why is that? Well, it's because both Peter and Paul were martyred, and they were both martyred in Rome. When you go to the Mediterranean, like not too long ago, I did my first pilgrimage to Greece and to parts of Turkey. And a lot of the times in the Bible and the Acts of the Apostles, the places that you'll read that the apostles went to, that was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. And you'll read, like when you hear St. Paul to the Galatians, where is that? That's in Turkey. Back then, that was like the Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire. Ephesus, where was that? Turkey again. Corinth, that was in Greece, okay? So all of those cool areas. And those churches are rightly very proud when they are able to say, you know what, this church was founded by St. Paul, or St. John the Apostle was here, or St. Thomas, or St. Bartholomew, or whatever. St. Andrew is a big one that'll be all over in the eastern parts. And they're rightly very proud. And sometimes they will have the relics of those saints, and they will be the patron. Well, Rome has two of the great saints, Peter and Paul, both. They were both martyred there. And you can ask yourselves, did you know that actually today, or these two saints are some of the only saints that actually get two feast days? So we have the conversion of St. Paul in February, we have the chair of St. Peter, I don't remember when it is, but I think around March. And then you have the feast of Saints Peter and Paul together. Does it ever occur to you that that's kind of weird? Why would they do that? Well, Father Eric, I will tell you. Because the history was this. During the times of Roman persecution, so like around the time of Nero did a good job killing people like St. Peter and St. Paul. I think both of them died under Nero, okay? And what happened to the early Catholics? So the early Catholics were persecuted. So they created what are called the catacombs. The catacombs were underground tunnels that were burial places. And the Roman soldiers were superstitious. They were scared of going down into the underworld where ghosts and demons and all that stuff would go. So the Romans didn't want to follow the Catholics down there. They knew they would go down there, but they said, you know what, I'm not going down there. So the Catholics knew we can go underground into these tunnels where we have tombs and where we can celebrate, where we'd set up altars and we can celebrate Mass and we won't get killed. And they had one altar where both the bones of St. Peter and St. Paul were together under one altar. I've celebrated Mass there. Their bones aren't there anymore, but I've celebrated Mass at that altar. And they would feel bad. It's like, today's the feast day of St. Peter. And they're thinking, well, poor St. Paul, we're ignoring you. And then the feast of St. Paul comes, and it's like, well, St. Peter, we're ignoring you. So they decided, I know, I've got a solution. We're going to come up with one feast for both of them. And that's what they did. And then what happened was, after the year 324, when Constantine made Catholicism legal, Then they removed the bones of Peter. He went back to St. Peter's Basilica, where the Vatican is, and they took the bones of St. Paul and stuck them out where St. Paul was martyred, which was outside the old city. That's why it's called St. Paul's, outside the walls. And on the days that they were martyred, they got their respective feast days back. So these guys get 2 feast days. So God in his providence did that because these guys were important. Another thing about Saints Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul both had their names changed by Jesus. Now, when Jesus changes your name, it's not like when I change your name. Sometimes when I can't remember what your name is, I'll say, "What's your name again?" From now, you know what? I'm just going to call you Judy. "My name is Amaryllis." No, you're Judy now. I can't remember Amaryllis, so you're Judy, okay? That's what Father Eric does. Jesus doesn't do that. Jesus remembers your name totally. But when Jesus decides to change your name, what's he doing? He's giving you a mission. He's saying, this is, from now on, this is going to be your identity. And when he said to St. Peter, he says, "Simon, from now on, you will be called Peter." What does that mean? Rock. "And on this rock I will build my church." What's he doing? He's saying, I'm giving you a new mission. Before you were Simon the fisherman, you were basically nobody. But I have called you. I have chosen you. I am giving you a mission. That's why when you get baptized, we receive baptismal names. Jesus is saying, I'm giving you a mission. I'm giving you a protector saint, but it's also saying you're getting a mission. Okay? And he did the same thing with St. Paul. St. Paul was converted after Jesus died. After the resurrection, he was out persecuting Catholics, and his name was Saul, Saul of Tarsus. And Jesus, we know the famous story when Jesus appeared to him. He's on the way to Damascus, and Jesus appears to him and says, "Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And he gives him a new name. He says, "You're going to be called Paul." You know what Paul means? It means little one, pequeñito. You would think of all the people that you would not call small, it's St. Paul. I think he was actually physically kind of small, but that wasn't Jesus' point. What Jesus' point is, he's saying, I'm giving you a new identity. Because St. Paul was a bull in a china shop. He was a genius. He was a zealot. If St. Paul lived today, he would have been kind of like the Taliban, or like one of these Islamic terrorists, but the Jewish version of it. He was out chasing people down, tracking them down, getting them dragged into prison and put to death if they would not renounce their faith. He was on fire to persecute the church. And Christ appears to him and transforms him and says, you're going to be small. Now, he didn't change his personality. St. Paul still had that fire and that zeal, and he was still a genius and wrote letters and just drove himself and was beaten and stoned and shipwrecked and all of those different things that we hear about over and over again. But we also read in sacred scripture that when he was with the people where he was founding his churches, he became a servant. He became meek. He became servicial to those he was serving. And God was basically saying, this is going to be your path. Humility. Both Peter and Paul, Christ gave them a mission, but both of them had to be humbled. St. Peter was full of himself. And on the night that Jesus was betrayed, St. Peter is saying, even if everybody else abandons you, I will not abandon you. And Jesus is like, Peter, tonight, 3 times you're going to deny you even know me. And he did. And it wasn't until after the resurrection that Jesus kind of picked him back up and asks him 3 times, Peter, do you love me? Actually, he didn't call him Peter. He says, Simon, do you love me? And he reconstituted, re-strengthened St. Peter in his mission. Both of these men were called to be strong men, but Jesus also showed them it's not going to be all about you. When you learn to be humble, That is when you are going to find the strength that you need, ultimately, to give your very lives. And that's the final thing I want to talk about. St. Paul, in the letter that we just read, he says, he used an expression that I've been meditating all week long. He says, I am being poured out like a libation. Oh. Because none of you actually know what a libation even is. Right? I'll give you 50 cents if you can tell me what a libation is. All right. A what? 50 cents coming your way. We got one smart person in the church. A libation it was wine, okay, that was reserved for a sacrifice. Not only, it wasn't a Catholic thing, it was a pagan thing, and also the Jews did it, but a sacrifice that you offer up to a god. You're saying, instead of us drinking this wine, which is good, we're going to pour it out in sacrifice in a liturgical kind of ceremony as my offering to God. And St. Paul says, my life is like that. I am the libation. I'm what's getting poured out. Over and over again, slowly throughout his ministry, he's dying to himself, being poured out for God, for the salvation of souls. Offered to God to save souls. And both Peter and Paul could have very legitimately said that about themselves. They were saints and they became martyrs because they were constantly giving everything they had to God and through God for the salvation of souls. And my brothers and sisters, this is what it means to be a Catholic. If we're not living that, if we don't understand that about our faith, you don't understand anything yet. If we don't understand that, we are cultural Catholics. We're going through the motions. Our faith is about becoming a living sacrifice and an offering to God for the salvation of souls. Only Catholics who live their lives that way are going to make a mark in eternity. Only Catholics who live their lives as a sacrifice offered to God for the salvation of souls are going to leave a legacy. And so many of us are Catholics by name, and yeah, we might sneak into heaven. But what mark are we going to make? Are we going to change society? Are people going to remember and say, that was a man of God, that was a woman of God, that was somebody who touched my life? Peter and Paul understood that, and that's why 2,000 years later, we're still celebrating their solemnity. So, happy feast day, happy solemnity of Saints Peter and Paul. And let's ask God to give us the same kind of generosity that these two men had, so that our lives will be, as the smart girl in the back said, liquid offerings made to God. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.